right, we'll go ahead and get started. So Caitlin's going to come up and Shanto, but I just had said I remind everyone that the Center for Political Science is having a very relevant lecture, the Miller Converse lecture, this Thursday at 4 p.m. Stanley Feldman will be talking on political polarization as well. So in INSAR, if you guys are available.
Hello, everyone. So I'm very excited to introduce you to today's speaker, Dr. Shanto Iyengar, who is a William Robertson Co-Professor of American Studies and Professor of Political Science and Communication at Stanford University, where he directs the Political Communication Laboratory. He is also the co-director of the Polarization Research Laboratory and the Co-Principal Investigator of the American National Election Studies, along with Dr. Valentino here at Michigan. Dr. Iyengar's research has been supported by grants from the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, the Ford Foundation, the Pew Charitable Trusts, and the Hewlett Foundation. He has written several books which have won awards, such as the Philip E. Converse Book Award of the American Political Science Association and the Goldsmith Book Prize from Harvard University. He is also the recipient of the Murray Edelman Distinguished Career Award. So Dr. Iyengar's research areas of expertise include the role of mass media in democratic societies, political opinion, and political psychology. Today, he'll be talking to us about the current state of the literature on affective polarization, and his talk titled Taking Stock of Research on Affective Polarization, Looking Back and Forward. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Shanto Iyengar.
Thanks, Caitlin, for that generous introduction. And thanks to everyone who helped make this possible. Obviously, I'm a big fan of the University of Michigan. It's great to be back here. I've spent countless days here.
It just felt like that.
Well, I was here even before you were around, Don. I was, as Mike Traugott was kind enough to send me photographic documentary evidence of the fact that I was here as a student in the 1970s, in the summer program, obviously. Well, okay, so without further ado, I want to make one point very clear. This is not like a typical talk where I present a paper and can take questions and criticisms accordingly. I'm talking now about an entire sort of a literature, and so feel free to interrupt at any point, because the attribution of responsibility is not exactly clear. It may not be my work you're commenting on, it may be someone else's. So anyway, so that's what I'm going to be talking about today is, what do we know about affective polarization? And are we in a position, as I will say towards the latter end of the talk, we are now supposedly where foundations are pouring millions of dollars into treatments, quote unquote, treatments that depolarize. Are we really in a position where we can do things like that? Perhaps that will stimulate some discussion, because I have fairly strong views about that. To give you a preview, I don't think we're in a position where we can be prescribing treatments. Okay, so obviously I'm going to begin with the Michigan connection, since a lot of the data on affective polarization stems from the American National Election Studies, which of course would not exist were it not for people who were here at this very same institute. Almost all of the survey data on the phenomenon of affective polarization derives from the ANES time series. And of course, it's Campbell, Converse, Miller, and Stokes. And later iterations of the original four, many of them are sitting in this room, including Don Kinder, Mitz Hutchings, Nick Valentino. So this database is certainly, Michigan can claim all the credit for that aspect of this literature. And I also want to make the point that it's not just the political scientists at Michigan who were instrumental in the development of this. So this is a really interesting quote from Oliver Miller's interesting sort of introspective piece on the history of the ANES. And he points out that there were a whole bunch of psychologists who were implicated in the development of the ANES as well, including, as you can see from this quote, including Bob Science, who, of course, I had the good fortune to interact with him once he moved to Stanford. Okay, so Michigan has had a lot to do with this literature. So historically speaking, the context here is that in political science, the initial wave of polarization research was heavily influenced by people in the modeling. The spatial model was really sort of the theoretical inspiration. This idea, the median voter theorem, and the Downsian logic about where is the median voter. And so there was all this work showing that at the elite level, if you looked at elected representatives, particularly if you looked at their roll call votes, there was pretty clear documentation that Democrats and Republicans had diverged, ideologically speaking. Democrats had become super liberal, Republicans had become super conservatives. So Keith Poole and Howard Rosenthal were obviously the two principal proponents of this view. Keith came up with the scaling algorithm that was used to DW nominate. However, when the question arose as to whether the American public was similarly polarized, here there was certainly no general agreement, and there still is an ongoing debate about the extent of ideological polarization at the level of the electorate. So you've got the people I'm calling the maximalists, most prominently my very good friend who we overlapped at Stony Brook for several years, Alan Abramowitz, has been writing extensively using ANES data, making the argument that over time, Democrats and Republicans have moved pretty much in the direction of their elites, Democrats moving away from the center in a leftward direction, and Republicans doing the same in a rightward direction. But my Stanford colleague, Mo Fiorina, has been equally prolific on the other side, publishing multiple pieces on essentially noting that the American public, this bimodality that you associate with polarization, with the peaks occurring at the extremes, is far from descriptive of American public opinion on almost any issue of current interest. And Fowler, Vavrick et al. Have a forthcoming paper which pretty much makes the same point, that moderates still rule the roost in terms of the mass public. Okay, so at that point, I would say, my take on the literature on polarization was, well, there seems to be this disconnect between elite polarization and mass polarization. That's an interesting question, and one can speculate about why that is. But if you wanted to know something about public opinion, it's not necessarily, we seem to have reached sort of a dead end, that there's this just ongoing debate to what, is it on a 7-point scale? Is it a 4.2 versus a 5.7? And is that polarization? And so on and so forth. So it seemed an opportune moment to sort of shift the debate a bit. And so we came up with this idea that perhaps we could rethink the logic of mass polarization from the standpoint of social identity theory, and simply to the extent that there was identification with a political entity, Democratic Party or the Republican Party, to what extent did that also mean that people with a partisan identity would express outgroup animus? And of course, the social psychologists in the room are well aware of social identity theory and decades of research documenting that there's this almost hardwired tendency for people affiliated with a group to express in-group favoritism and outgroup animus. And so we wondered, would that same characterization hold to the concept of party identification? And we had some pretty strong priors to expect that it might, since after all, this is another Michigan connection. We had very interesting longitudinal data suggesting that the notion of partisan identity, the idea that you consider yourself either a Democrat or a Republican, is something that is acquired fairly early on. And in this panel study, the Jennings and Nemi high school senior study, which tracked graduating seniors in the class of 1965 and surveyed them and then repeatedly resurveyed them, I think 5 separate waves, going all the way through perhaps 2005 or 2006. I've forgotten the date of the last wave. But the important point to note here is that party ID is pretty stable over time. This is individual level panel data, and it's not ephemeral, to say the least. So it seems to be a salient, it's a genuine identity. And there's also a lot of socialization data from the 1960s, suggesting that it's acquired at a very early age, certainly at a pre-cognitive development stage. Pretty much kindergarteners were being found in the 1960s to have a pretty well-developed sense of I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican. And we were talking about this earlier on in the grad seminar. There's this, the United States seems to be quite distinctive in its, in the extent to which people are asked to participate in electioneering. For one thing, we have, it's a federal system, so the number of times you vote compared to the normal British citizen, I think a conservative estimate would be that Americans probably vote in probably 10 times more frequently than the average Brit, since we have national elections, state elections, local elections. And on top of that, we have this idea of the permanent campaign. In Spain, the campaigning is fixed at 15 days. In most European countries, I think the maximum would be 60 days. Whereas in this country, of course, it is said that the campaign for the next cycle begins the day after the election. So all of these things would lead you to suspect that this identity in question, partisanship, is something that people are encountering on a chronic basis. That is to say, they're being repeatedly reminded of their partisan affiliation. So in that sense, if we would anticipate that you're going to get this in-group, out-group phenomenon of interest, the favoritism animus syndrome, we would expect you would have strong expectations to that effect. So let's look at the ways in which people have tried to sort of observe this. So the indicators of out-group animus in particular, in-group favoritism, it turns out, it's not that much it's not very interesting, because it turns out over time, it seems to be a constant. That the level of affinity for your fellow partisans is, people are enthusiastic, but the ebbs and flows tend to be minimal, whereas a lot of the movement we observe is occurring at the level of out-group animus. Well, first of all, obviously the most important measure of out-group animus we have are the feeling thermometers. I'm going to show you exactly what I mean. These have been on the ANES since 1968, but more systematically since the 1970s. So we have a continuous measure of how do you feel about both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party over the last 50 odd years. So obviously that's going to be our main source of evidence. We also have secondary measures of social distance, which has to do primarily about how do you feel about the close interpersonal relations with people who are on the opposing party. There's a very famous study done in the 1950s, the Alman and Werber study of civic culture. And for some reason, they asked this question about how would you feel if your son or daughter were to marry someone? They would provide the party of which party is your son or daughter marrying into, so you could look at whether or not it was from the same party as responded or some other party. And of course, that's an interesting baseline because it's well before polarization developed. And as you can imagine, and I'll show you the slide in a minute, most people who were asked that question, they had trouble actually comprehending the question. They were wondering, why would I feel anything about someone marrying a Democrat or Republican? Presumably, if it was a Democrat, you might imagine they'd be quite pleased about the prospect of marrying a Republican, since it might mean economic mobility. But at any rate, the bottom line is there was zero social distancing in the Alman and Werber study, but in replications since then, we observe fairly significant increases. The third indicator of affective polarization, and maybe this is a more stringent indicator, is that you have the kind of finding that people are dividing in a variety of non-political domains. They're dividing along party lines. So I think the COVID pandemic and views about vaccination, views about masking, that would be sort of a case of spillover. I mean, why would, this is an entirely non-political domain. Why should Democrats and Republicans differ on questions of public health? And there's a whole bunch of other studies. Sean Westwood and I ran this study where we gave people, the audit type studies, we gave them resumes and asked them to evaluate whether these kids were worthy of a scholarship. And it turned out that when we inserted some very subtle cues about their extracurricular activities, being the president of Young Republicans or the president of Young Democrats, those cues turned out to be very powerful in determining the scholarship person that people selected. And that trumped sort of the credentials such as GPA. And finally, if you subscribe to the view that survey research on matters of outgroup animus is to be taken with a grain of salt, that maybe there's a lot of cheap talk here, what some people might call cheerleading, and you want to see some real behavioral evidence, well, there's quite a bit of evidence along those lines today, primarily from use of either the trust or dictator game, where people are given money and asked to donate some to the second player, and I'll say more about that in a minute. And it turns out you get fairly large penalties for when you're playing with someone from the opposing side, the donation is significantly diminished. So that would seem to be more compelling evidence than what someone says in the context of a survey. Okay, so here's the ANS feeling thermometer, essentially asking people to rate a variety of targets, individuals or groups on a scale going from 0, very cold or unfavorable feeling, to 100. And there's the midpoint where you don't have any feelings whatsoever. And there's this card that in the face-to-face condition is read out to the respondent. And I'll say more about the fact that in 2012, the ANES developed the online platform, where it's self-administered, where the respondent does all of the work on their own. And you might, well, we'll get to that. There are significant mode effects, as you might imagine. Okay, so this is the, so here's the time series. I don't want to act like we're taking credit here for this, but this is the only data presentation I can think of that this was on the front page of the New York Times. I think it was maybe in 2017, where they actually, the New York Times ran a story on polarization, and they produced the same graph using the ANES data, and they cited the ANES right there on the front page of the New York Times. So you can see that the green line is the in-group rating, and it's not changing very much. There's a slight uptick around mid-1980s or so, but it's pretty much in the 70s, whereas the blue, the thermometer rating of the opposing party begins to decline probably around the late 1980s or 1990s, kind of a mini peak. And from then on, you see it's a pretty steady decline. And in the last 3 or 4 cycles, it's been a pretty precipitous decline. The one point I would make is you can ask about whether the party is the relevant target. Should we be asking about the Democratic Party or the Republican Party in the thermometers? But what happens when you substitute the name of the nominee? If you look at the presidential candidate in that year, as you can see, it's pretty much, these are fairly overlapping time series. So the party measure or the candidate measure, it doesn't matter which one you look at, you're going to see the same increasing in-group, out-group score over time. Now, this is looking at, if you look at the blue line, these are the people who give the out party the lowest possible score, that is to say 0. And as you can see, in the last 3 cycles, there's a non-trivial share of the sample that is willing to say or respond 0. And I've inserted this note here about the significant mode effects post 2012. And I'm not sure what to make of the mode effect. I mean, it's clearly a significant effect, statistically speaking. That is to say, when you're in the face-to-face condition, when you're being interviewed, and the interviewer is sitting right across from you, you're much more likely to moderate your evaluation of the out party. And when you're in the online mode, you're more likely to give an extreme, a lower thermometer score. Now, which of these is biased? Well, probably both. And it's not clear to me. If I was to guess, I would probably argue that the level of distortion is probably greater in the face-to-face interview, since the social norms governing civility and normal human discourse are very much in favor of being polite and being sort of civil. So you could argue that perhaps if you were trying to come up with what is the true score, what I'm saying is that I wouldn't necessarily say that it's the face-to-face interview that is the truer measure of out-group animus. I mean, so you could argue it both ways. Anyway, it's about between a 5 and 6 percentage point difference in the thermometer score. So it's a pretty big effect that you're getting increased out-group animus in the privacy of your own home, in the anonymous setting of an online survey. That's clearly encouraging the expression of out-group animus. Now, there's also data, I was talking about the socialization literature, so there's this study from the 1980s. Steve Chafee and David Sears did this study on middle school children, and it's not the same feeling thermometer. They asked a question about trust in the Democratic or Republican parties, and you can see the original data is on the left side of this graph. You can see that the rating of the in-party, the trust in the in-party and trust in the out-party is not significantly different from each other. So you wouldn't see any traces of polarization, but we replicated the exact same question in 2019. As you can see, by then the kids in middle school and high school are pretty much emulating their parents, suggesting that this is something that is being transmitted across the generations. Okay, now, I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago in which this paper was presented using feeling thermometers, and you can see the divide, the ratings for Republicans and Democrats seem to be on the same order of magnitude as the Israeli-Palestinian divide in Israel, which obviously raises questions about, are we on the verge of some kind of civil strife? Is it really, is the partisan cleavage in the United States equivalent to the nationality cleavage in the Middle East? Well, it seems to be, again, if you've post-January 6th, maybe the evidence, we should have known all along that was going to happen, given these kinds. I guess the question I'm asking is, are these feeling thermometers cheap talk, or are they really diagnostic of this sort of genuine reservoir of ill will that might perhaps lead to support for anti-democratic norms, willingness to engage in illegal activity, willingness to support political violence? And there's been a lot of commentary on that of late. I would hold off on drawing any firm conclusions. I'm going to get to that. What little evidence we have to date suggests that there is not much spillover from the feeling thermometers to these behavioral measures of democratic backsliding. So let's hold off on that, but that's an interesting point worthy of further discussion. Okay, and the final point I want to make is, of course, that there's something about partisanship that should be distinguished from other forms of social identity, things like race and ethnicity and gender and religion. So you can see from the feeling thermometers, Christians, Catholics, Hindus, Muslims, atheists, race, SES, middle class, poor, rich. You can see those divides do not elicit the same level of polarization on the thermometers. So the gold standard seems to be the party divide. So my point here is that if you can imagine yourself as a respondent in one of these ANES surveys, and keep in mind that the feeling thermometer battery, it's not a trivial encounter with the interviewer. You're being asked to give a thermometer score for pretty close to 20 different targets. Catholics, Jews, Hindus, Muslims. You can imagine the respondent, he's being asked all these questions, and then finally he gets a question about Democrats and Republicans. So you can imagine that there might be some pent-up demand that all these, I've been prevented, I've been unable to give you my genuine feeling about any of these groups because I've been constrained by the norms, and now at last you give me an opportunity. Zero. Perhaps maybe it's the pent-up demand that is driving. But again, keep in mind, this is face-to-face. And so you've got the countervailing norm, which is, you better be polite and nice and civil. But despite that, you're getting this big sort of advantage from the pro-polarization point of view. Yeah.
So don't you have experiments where you manipulate the order of the targets?
I believe it's randomized in most cycles, so it's not.
I mean, your argument would be that this is something that happens later on.
Yeah, I'm going to get to that. There's one of the plausible mechanisms. So we've just got a paper on that. The ANAS, as you know, is full of questions of partisan valence. Even before you get to the thermometer section, I've counted. You've answered 50 questions that have a very clear partisan valence. Evaluations of the performance of the incumbent president, the likes and dislikes of the candidates, the likes. So you can imagine what's happening here. If you're a respondent and you've been asked, I've just given you a partisan response indicating that I'm a Democrat or a Republican 50 times before you've asked me the thermometers. Obviously, I've been rehearsed by now. You can say that my partisanship has been primed because I've just gone through this task, a very detailed task, in which I've told you that I like Democrats and I dislike Republicans. And so obviously, when you ask me the thermometers, I'm going to give you a fairly extreme. So the experimental test of interest, it seems to me, is to run a survey in which there is zero partisan valence in the survey content, and then insert the thermometers and see what happens. That would be where it's absolutely fresh. The first question with any partisan valence is the thermometer. I think that would be a relevant test. I'll tell you right now that we did that. We didn't do it on the scale of the ANES because obviously we couldn't incentivize anyone to sit for an online survey that took 60 minutes. So we only did it, it was only 15 minutes, but in the one condition, there was literally zero political content. And the other condition, we put in all of the ANES, the standard likes, dislikes. And we got exactly the same level of thermometer polarization in the non-political condition as in the political condition. So yes, that's subject to, we can certainly test that, but in the context of the ANES, given the saturation level of partisan valence, the other point I would make is, again, this is going to come up later on, but since you've raised the question, I'll bring it up right now, is for the first time in 2020, we decided to do a collaboration, the ANES with the GSS. The General Social Survey, which is the counterpart in sociology, is a national face-to-face, although with the pandemic, it was all online. The political content of the GSS compared to the ANES is muted. Partisan valence in the GSS is much lower. There is political content. How much money should we be spending on various items? How much confidence do you have in Congress? They're up. Approximately a third of the GSS questions can be characterized of having some political content, but a much smaller percentage of the GSS could be said to be strong partisan valence. You're not constantly asking questions about how much do you like or dislike Donald Trump or Joe Biden, as is the case with the ANES. So the GSS is sort of a nice control group, if you will. And because I was involved with setting up the collaboration with the GSS, obviously I asked them, as part of this deal, they were going to include a module of ANES questions on the GSS. And obviously I made it a point that the thermometers were going to be included. So the GSS, and you can now look at it, the GSS has the two party thermometers. And they answered the party ID question and one other question. There's two questions with partisan valence before they got to the thermometers. So I was holding my breath before we got the GSS data, but the GSS data, guess what? It's just as polarized. So the feeling thermometers on the GSS, where presumably this kind of partisan priming is minimized, shows exactly the same level of polarization. So on both scores, I would suggest that the thermometers they're pretty robust. It doesn't seem to be the case that there's some kind of artifact to the fact that you're forcing people to answer all these political questions and that somehow causing them, self-perception theory and all of that they figure out that they are, they're either super Democratic or Republican because they've gone through this ritual of answering these 50 questions. So I don't know if I've answered the question, Don, but it seems like on measurement grounds, it
Well,
appears
it
to be.
raises another question, which is why social norms don't constrain our feelings about partisan. The way you claim that.
Well, why wouldn't they? Well, because it's a voluntary, it's not inherited, it's not kind of protected. We shouldn't feel that we should be constrained in any way, which is why I was saying you would have pent up demand. Because all these other groups are protected. And given what we know about power of social norms, especially today, I think people are going to be super circumspect in what they say. So in that sense, this is one group that's not subject to the same constraint because you chose your party. It's your fault. I can hold you accountable. I can blame you. I can't blame you for anything else. That's descriptive. Okay, so I don't want to get, feeling thermometers are just, sure, they're part of the enterprise of measuring it, but given the fact there are all these other indications, so if you look at presidential performance, how do people evaluate the incumbent? You can see that there's a huge partisan gap now in these approvals. And it's really, Gary Jacobson is the person who's done the most work on this, and he's documented this. If you just track it over time, it's massive. The partisan gap in evaluations of incumbent approval is now huge. So if you look at Trump, it's night and day. Democratic approval versus Republican approval, it's like, that's kind of an order of magnitude that's pretty massive.
So Shanto, which one is right?
Who is right? Well, but why do we care? All we want to know is there out-group animus? So it seems pretty clear to me that.
I retract my question.
Oh, you're getting back to the question of face-to-face versus online. Which one is right?
No, you're way deeper than I am. I just told a stupid joke, that's all.
Okay, well, you'll have to deconstruct that later on. Okay, social distancing. That's again this idea of that party divisions are producing interpersonal tensions, and that there's a sense that therefore people are going to distance themselves on the basis of the political divide. So if you're a Democrat and I'm a Republican, I don't want to have a beer with you. I was talking to Amy earlier on about, it just tells us how far we've come from, in the 2000 election, I'm old enough to remember the focus groups that were being run. Stanley Greenberg was working for Bill Clinton and then later on Al Gore, and was finding in these focus groups that people were saying, that they'd rather sit down and have a beer with George Bush than with Al Gore. And that was like, that's just 20 years ago. Today, I don't think you'll find too many Democrats saying they would like to have a beer with Donald Trump, no matter how awful the Democratic candidate might be. But anyway, the point is, you can see now we've got a lot of compelling data from online dating sites suggesting that political similarity is a big driver of interpersonal attraction. I think the Huber and Malhotra study is pretty compelling. There are other studies by Rose McDermott and her colleagues showing that there's a lot of what people reveal on these online dating sites is quite strategic. That's why the Huber and Malhotra finding is so compelling, is that people are not openly advertising their political preferences, because obviously they want to maximize the potential out there in the market. They're not going to say, I voted for Trump 3 times. That's not revealed. But somehow people extract that information in the preliminary exchanges that occur. I told Greg Huber that when they were writing up that paper, you really need to make that point that your result is a super robust finding, because you really have to dig into that to get that information. It's not easily accessible. But the finding is that it's the number one predictor of success, meaning where people actually ended up going out, where there was some kind of a relationship that was established. Political ideology was the strongest predictor. And of course, then we've got all this other data on the composition of your friendship groups and so on and so forth. So all of this is suggesting that there's definitely spillover from the political divide into interpersonal interactions. And to take you to the next step, here's the Armin and Werber data from the 1950s, which is the left panel. As you can see, if you look at the British two-party system that's comparable, you can see that in the 1960 data, not even 5% of the American sample said they would be displeased with the prospect of having an opposing partisan as a son-in-law or daughter-in-law. But then, don't ask me why that question was not asked for the next 48 years. You'll have to ask Doug Rivers about that. But we inserted that into a YouGov. My colleague, Doug Rivers, was the person who founded the company with Norman and I, a company that was initially called Polymetrics, that eventually morphed into this major online vendor of online surveys. It's now known as YouGov. So we got Doug to put in a question in 2008. As you can see, there's this striking uptick in the proportion of partisans who now respond feeling somewhat or very upset, and then 2 years later, even more so. Whereas in the British case, there's no such corresponding increase over time. So that's a second sort of, in addition to the thermometers, we now have this kind of overtime data suggesting that people are choosing to segregate interpersonally on the basis of their politics. And then, of course, there's all this evidence now on couples, and homophily, the idea that you're selecting into a long-term relationship based on political preference, as opposed to a variety of alternative explanations, which I don't have time to get into, but there's obviously all kinds of other explanations as to why you might end up in a long-term relationship with a fellow Democrat or a fellow Republican. But the fact that you end up with someone who's got the same political, that may have had nothing to do with the selection itself, okay? But take my word for it. There's a paper, Tobias Konitzer, myself, and a couple of other people, where we test the selection mechanism against these alternatives, and we argue that it is indeed selection. But there's a lot of the Huber-Malhotra thing, and this finding from the paper I just cited, that the number of couples today in which there is the potential for this kind of conflict or tension arising from political disagreement is about 15%. Whereas in the 1965 study, I believe that's the next slide, if you look at 1965, that's the Jennings and Nimi study in which the high school seniors, also a sample of their parents, were interviewed. You can see it's barely above 50%. It's close to 60% had the same political party affiliation. So you've got this dramatic increase in homogeneity of the household over time. And you have to take my word for it. As I say, the argument is that this increase is attributable to selection and not to these alternative mechanisms that we can talk about. Okay, and then finally, given getting those 4 indicators that I talked about earlier, here's the behavioral data. If you're an anti-survey person and you don't think anything I've said to this point is meaningful, well, maybe this will be more convincing. So, economists, behavioral economists in particular, have been working with the dictator game and the trust game for years. The dictator game is pretty straightforward. You simply tell the respondent, I'm going to give you 10 bucks. You're going to be playing with the player 2, and you're given a capsule description of who you are playing with. So obviously in our studies, we manipulate their political affiliation. We say they're a Democrat or a Republican, in addition to a whole bunch of other stuff about their age, where they live, so on and so forth. And then you're asked, well, okay, you can now just donate. I've just given you 10 bucks. You can give as much of that as you like to player 2. And that's it. And of course, if you're an economist, the real question of interest is why the dictator game is now being administered in something like 50 different countries. And on average, about 1/3 of the initial donation is donated, which is obviously totally irrational from the standpoint of economic theory. You could just keep all of the $10, but for some reason, people give about 30% of it, and it just happens. The trust game is an iteration of that. Here you're told that, look, whatever you donate, the people running the study will triple that, and then player 2 can return some of that back to you. So there's this kind of strategic element in the trust game. So you might anticipate that people anticipating some reciprocity might be a bit more generous. Well, anyway, the point of so Sean Westwood and I, in our original paper, we implemented the trust game. I think we did both actually. Both games obviously yield a behavioral measure. It's commonly used in the comparative politics literature and political science. Any transfer distribution, you can, since if you decide to sort of penalize people in terms of how much you're giving, the only way you can explain that is it must be because you have decided to discriminate on that basis. Whatever the relevant behavioral cue was that you provided in your description, that's obviously, since that's the manipulation, that's the only explanation for the outcome. So here's what we found in the dictator game. There's like a $1.50 penalty for being on the opposing side. You only get $2.50, whereas if you're a same party as player one, you get $4. And in the trust game, it's somewhat reduced, but it's still significant. So this has been replicated multiple times. Yes?
And just a quick question, are real incentives or not?
Are these real? Oh yeah, people are actually receiving the payoffs. Absolutely. No. I mean, the IRB wouldn't approve if it wasn't genuine. And in fact, this is a footnote. Matt McGubbins, the late Matt McGubbins, who I actually worked quite closely with in the years before his untimely and premature death. He did because he suspected that because these are all virtual. These are all games being played online. And so he actually, we never published it, but he ran a study face-to-face, more conventional, old-fashioned way, and found exactly the same phenomenon. So I'm fairly confident that this is not an artifact of the platform on which these games were played. Okay, there's this other, I told you about these audit studies. So Sean and I did this where we gave them these resumes, and as I said earlier, we manipulated various different aspects of the resume, but it turned out that the extracurricular cue about being active in party politics, being the president of the Young Republicans or Young Democrats, was a super powerful predictor of which kid ended up winning the scholarship. Gift and gift is an interesting study. It's actual job resumes being mailed out in heavily Democratic counties. People who indicated their Democratic affiliation were more likely to get a call back, and the corresponding bias, as you can see, this is something that appeared in political behavior. And there's a whole bunch of other studies, mutual fund managers, and my Stanford colleague Neil Malhotra has collaborated. So there's a lot of evidence now that it's influencing economic behavior, which again, this is totally non-political. Why should the party cue make any difference? So the very fact that you're getting this kind of spillover is indicative of the power of partisanship and the extent to which the partisan cue is now being exported into these ostensibly non-political domains. And sometimes these non-political domains might have life and death consequences, which then presumably that makes the polarization test especially robust. I mean, if you're willing to die in the name of maintaining in-group favoritism, well, that seems to me to be a pretty rigorous test of polarization. And here you see very clearly the fact that Republicans have a very significant lag in terms of adopting the appropriate public health behaviors. Okay, so the COVID, and there's all kinds of papers now on different manifestations of this blue-red gap in the area of public health behavior. And this is one of my kind of favorite examples. This idea that people are now willing to sign in, they're willing to subscribe to these rather eccentric beliefs about things like wiretaps on Trump Tower, no rushing. As you can see now, Republicans are much more likely to be misinformed. And we were talking about this earlier in the grad class. There is this ongoing debate in political science about whether these quote unquote misinformed responses are sincere, or alternatively, are they simply, people say, well, I know there was no such thing as a wiretap, but I'm a Republican, I'm just going to say that because it makes me feel good. I'm supporting Donald Trump. That's the so-called cheerleading explanation for misinformation. And presumably, one way of getting around that is by making it more costly for people to give the misinformed response. And so people have adopted this design of paying people, offering them a cash incentive for giving the objectively correct answer. And presumably, if you're going to earn money for being truthful, these partisan gaps ought to disappear. And the initial round of studies by John Bullock et al. And Marcus Pryor and Skip Lapia found indeed that when they incentivized, the level of misinformation was significantly reduced. However, the questions that were featured in those studies were not high on partisan valence. If you take a look at the content of those knowledge questions, they were pretty much standard, what is the size of the federal deficit? I think one of the questions was, what is John McCain's middle name, or something like that. Not questions like, did Obama wiretap Trump Tower? Did millions of illegals vote in the election? I mean, these are obviously valence questions coming right out of the mouth of the Republican candidate for the president of the United States. So Eric Peterson and I replicated the cash incentives study with these questions, and we got the reduction in the level of misinformation was on the order of magnitude of under 5%. So we don't think it's cheerleading. I don't think the folks who marched on the Capitol were cheerleading. I think it was genuine. So in other words, misinformation is indeed a spillover effect of polarization. Okay, so now enough on, I've probably gone overtime as it is. No, good. So I want to now move to this question of everything I've said up to this point is simply descriptive. We've documented this phenomenon of increasing outgroup animus. I want to now talk about what are the possible explanations for why we do it. The first explanation is simply this: in the jargon of political science, it's called sorting. And sorting is simply, if you're more of a comparative politics person, it's this idea that political cleavages and socioeconomic cleavages are becoming more closely aligned. So this idea that you have reinforcing as opposed to cross-cutting cleavages. So in this country, it's pretty clear that over the last 50 years, there's been a very clear pattern in favor of increased reinforcement. So if you look at the racial divide, the gender divide, religious in terms of whether you're non-religious or religious, you clearly see this pattern that I've indicated. Your Democrats are non-white, female, urban, non-religious, and young. Republicans are on the other side on each of these divides. So that's the case, and we know from the comparative politics literature, when you have a country like Belgium, where you have people divided by language, by geography, and by religion, the potential for strife is amplified. Reinforcing cleavages tend to be more associated with violent outcomes. So if you buy into that logic, we ought to find more polarization because we've got greater sorting. There's also this other definition of sorting, which is that for years, the ANES has asked people not only about their party, but also, do you consider yourself to be liberal or conservative? And of course, in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, the two parties were quite diverse on the question of ideology. We had liberal Republicans from the upper Midwest and Northeast. We had conservative Democrats, most notably in the South. But then, of course, post-1980, as the party system has gotten sorted ideologically, there's obviously very few liberal Republicans and very few conservative Democrats. So the upshot, based on this phenomenon of increased sorting, ought to be strengthened polarization. And in fact, if you replicate that feeling thermometer, so if you just look at liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans, it's off the scale. But if you look at that, the thermometer difference is 56, whereas for all the slide I showed you earlier, the thermometer difference is about 49. So it's a pretty robust increase in affective polarization associated with this idea of sorting. Okay, so that's a fairly straightforward explanation. If you look at family homogeneity, this is a really massive effect. When we went, for some reason, we never got this paper published. I can't remember why. I think the reviews were, were not super negative. They were not super positive, but we could have done something with it. But Tobias was too busy finding a job with a startup, and we ended up not doing anything with it. if you look at people living in mixed households and thermometers for Clinton and Trump, as you can see, they're pretty moderate. So when you've got exposure to, if you're in a cross-pressured household, you don't say really bad things about the presidential candidate. Whereas when you're in the same party household, you get the outgroup thermometer rating is pretty negative. So anyway, that's the sorting explanation. Explanation number two, which is something to do with a phenomenon that's very close to my own research agenda, is obviously the media system, the information environment that Americans find themselves. If you're old enough, as I am, to have lived through the 60s and 70s, in which everyone listened to one of three major national newscasts. You had the ABC Evening News, the CBS Evening News, and the NBC Evening News. And those three channels, the combined audience for those three channels was close to 2/3 of the voting age electorate. So basically every voting age citizen was encountering the same information environment. You would call that an information commons. It was the same subject matter. We've actually got good data on that. Justin Grimmer and I have scraped the entire Vanderbilt abstracts, and we show that in the 70s, the three networks are essentially substitute. I mean, there's no difference. Even almost the ordering of the news items are almost the same. So the agenda is absolutely common. The same subject matter being covered in the three networks. Today, obviously, we've got a high choice media environment, and we've got a fundamental change in the journalistic paradigm, thanks to Rupert Murdoch and the onset of cable. We now have a partisan journalistic paradigm where you can provide news in the guise of commentary. So that's a huge change. Now, for many years, people have been arguing, my colleague Mo Fiorina has been quite vocal on this point. Well, the cable news audience is not that big. If you look at the Nielsen ratings for any particular program on Fox, Hannity or Tucker Carlson, the two highest rated, they're between 2 and 3 million. And you could say, compared to the days that I was talking about, when you had 65% of the whole country watching those three networks, that's like peanuts. But well, there's this new law firm in political science, the law firm of Brockman and Culler, which reminds me of the law firm of Gerber and Green. In the old days, if you wanted to know anything about campaign GOTV, getting out the vote, you would have to consult Gerber and Green. I dare say in the next decade or so, if there's anything you want to know about selective exposure, you're going to have to consult Brockman and Culler. Because they've just got this paper, which I read 2 weeks ago, where they actually have, for the first time, amassed Nielsen ratings on all the cable news outlets. And they have merged the Nielsen ratings with various other auxiliary databases, which allow them to look at the partisan composition of the cable audience. Well, the first thing they find, as a quote here from their paper, approximately 1 in 7 Americans consume over 8 hours a month. By Nielsen standards, that's like high exposure of television, of partisan television, consistent with selective exposure. And about 2/3 of partisan media viewers are aligned partisans. So once again, I don't want to, but if you want to deconstruct what's going on here, so for the last 25 years, there's been this strange disconnect in people studying selective exposure. There's a variety of people using experimental studies where people are invited into the lab, they're given a bunch of headlines. The same headlines are attributed to different news sources, and the bottom line evidence from these experimental studies is, yes, Republicans click on headlines when it's coming from Fox, Democrats click on headlines when it's coming from Huffington Post or MSNBC. But the observational studies, which derive primarily to date from web browsing data has been in vogue now for about 20 years. The web browsing studies have repeatedly showed almost no evidence of segregation on the basis of where people click. So Andy Guess at Princeton has written 2 or 3 papers on this, and my colleague Matt Genskow and his longtime collaborator Jesse Shapiro wrote the path-breaking paper, Genskow and Shapiro, from about 2011, I believe. And they have a quote in there something to the effect that the typical webs, you're likely to encounter more partisan segregation at your local grocery store than you are at any online news site. Well, one of the problems with that web browsing literature is that they include what I would call portal websites, like MSN or Yahoo and Google. These are multi-use sites that they're not just providing you with news. I mean, the people who go to MSN, I happen to know a lot of people in their 60s and 70s who still use Hotmail. And Hotmail have got, why do you go to MSN? You go to MSN to check your Hotmail. Those, and obviously you're not going to find any partisan segregation by including MSN and these portal sites. So Justin Grimmer and I decided, we were fed up of reading all this stuff on no selective exposure. So we finally wrote a paper in which we took out the portal sites and we looked at web browsing only dedicated news providers. So the only visits we're tracking are visits to websites that specialize, like New York Times, Washington Post, CNN. There's about 300. Nothing else. You can't go check your email and make bets on horse racing or anything. Well, guess what? It turns out there's a significant level of partisan segregation when you take out the portal sites. So the disconnect between the experimental and the observational is not as pronounced as you might be led to believe. So so now we are now getting a whole bunch of studies along they're called deprivation studies, where it's sort of an interesting design where people are being paid to stop, to sort of kind of provide a temporary blockage to their exposure to polarizing information. So Brockman and Kalla have done this most recently, got a lot of press play, where they paid people to stop watching Fox for a month and instead to watch CNN. And of course, the immediate short-term effect of that was, as you might anticipate, it was depolarizing. But when they did a delayed post-test, I think it was only 10 days after the initial, the effect disappeared. So it's hard to know what to make of that. And various people, Reed Alcott, who collaborates with Matt Genskow, they've done the same thing on a larger scale with Facebook, and they too have found slight traces of depolarization. So that's an interesting design, and I think we're going to see more of that down the road. So whether or not you can experimentally, in a sense, provide some sort of obstacle to selective exposure, and then in a causal sense, obviously, that's giving you some leverage of the question of whether selective exposure is contributing to polarization. Okay, and I'm just putting in a plug for that paper by Justin et al., which excludes the portals. Okay, so that's the second possible explanation. The third, and the one that I'm particularly attached to, since I also have an interest in TV advertising, having done some studies along those lines a long time ago, is exposure to campaigns. As I pointed out at the outset, we have an outlier. The United States is in terms of the length of the campaign, the exposure to a multiplicity of campaigns, and you have this trend tracking the content of campaign advertising. And as you can see, the dark and the gray contrast is just a euphemism. It's essentially an attack ad in which you've got maybe 5 seconds of positive information thrown in about the sponsoring candidate. It's not 100% attack. So you can see that the tone of modern campaigning, it's very much a dominant strategy to attack your opponent. So maybe exposure to negative campaigning is contributing to some kind of opinion leadership effect here, and that's contributing to outgroup ends. So we've been compiling data on a daily basis over the last several months, and we're going to be continuing this over the next several years. So by the time 2024 rolls around, we'll be highly powered to detect state-by-state type effects. And as you can see, even by 2022, if you look, this is simply plotting the degree of the thermometer difference between those two thermometers. And you can see at the bottom, you've got Wyoming, Oklahoma, North Dakota, West Virginia, Idaho, states that are not by any means competitive, where you're not going to have high levels of campaigning. Whereas at the top, you've got Michigan, Wisconsin, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, Nevada, Arizona, suggests to me that the volume of campaigning has something to do with the level of polarization. This is early days. I would say stay tuned. A year from now, 18 months from now, we'll have better data. But I have pretty strong priors that this is going to be a strong predictor of the level of affective polarization. Okay, finally, this is the what I mentioned at the outset. I'm still on time, good. The treatments, potential treatments for affective polarization. Foundations are pouring millions of dollars. My Stanford colleague, Rob Willer, has pioneered the Strengthening Democracy Challenge that some of you may be aware of, where he's asked scholars from across the world to propose treatments for reducing affective polarization. And he ran a competition where the mega study where he tested 25 of he had a panel of judges rate the proposed treatments, and the ones that got selected were then actually tested. I'm about to show you one of the most popular of the treatments is correcting inaccurate perceptions of the opposing party. Nina Sakharov has written important papers on this. Essentially, when you find, people have these exaggerated stereotypes of the opposition, and when you provide them with corrective information, it goes away. The affective polarization is dramatically reduced, and it's been documented now in 26 different countries. It seems pretty promising. But then Jamie Druckman, who is actually co-authored on a couple of the papers showing that misperceptions are very good, very powerful treatment. He's now got a paper showing, Jamie has always been promoting this argument that you have to do two-sided framing. You can't just give them one side. So he's run a study where he gives them the corrective information and he gives them the stereotypic information. And of course, I'm sure, as I was saying at the seminar, I would be very curious to know how his co-authors, his earlier co-authors feel about this. But of course, he finds that the effect disappears. So that the correcting misperception treatment may not be as powerful as we've been led to believe. Okay, here's the top performing. This is in the Democracy Channel, as you can see. You've got almost every treatment has a depolarizing effect, which to me, the most plausible explanation for this is that there's got to be some kind of experimental demand. It's kind of hard to believe that every single treatment would be effective. But that's, in fact, this is just in terms of thermometers. The outcome variable here is animosity. So no matter what you do, you can reduce outgroup animus. But when you say, what about other kinds of things? What about support for anti-democratic norms? Now the treatments don't, the same treatments, it seems to be a very mixed bag. You've got about 4 treatments that work, and you've got 4 treatments that produce opposite effects, where you're getting people actually more willing to support anti-democratic practices. So anyway, I don't want to belabor the point, and I don't want to unnecessarily give Rob's project give it any scrutiny. But my point is I want to engage in some commentary here, which is what I alluded to at the outset. And the foundations are literally pouring millions of dollars into these short-term fixes. Polarization, as I described it, has taken about 50 years to develop. And we're being asked to believe that these short form, by the way, one of the treatments that works, I actually took the treatment. And I'm telling you, it's a 6-minute self-meditation. That's what it is. And it's a guy speaking with an English accent. And it depolarizes people. My own reaction, my blood pressure actually went up. So it was not, certainly did not work as advertised with me. So I'm dubious because I don't think a 2-minute, 3-minute experimental nudge is sufficient to erase 50 minutes worth of societal level changes. Most interventions focus on attributes of partisans, i.e. correcting accuracy, making them more empathic, whereas the underlying causes may not be dispositional, but societal. So we may have some kind of a fundamental attribution error at work here. And as I said earlier, if you don't understand what's causing the problem, then you're going to be engaging in this kind of symptom-based treatment logic, which I think the history of medicine certainly has convinced me that's not a good way to proceed. And there is finally this problem of how do you scale up these treatments. I'm constantly arguing with my colleague Jim Fishkin about this, because he's come up with this notion of the deliberative poll, where you invite, you bring 200 people together, give them all kinds of high quality information about both sides of an issue. You have experts you can ask questions of, and after deliberation, yes, indeed, people become less polarized, or in the case of particular issues, they become less pro-death penalty, so on and so on. But it's a counterfactual in the sense that people never encounter that environment in the real world. So what is the point? I mean, yes, if you had a kind of an ideal scenario, that's fine and dandy, but in terms of emulating the real world, it doesn't seem to fit that well. Okay, so finally, I want to just close with this. Does polarization represent this? A lot of people have been arguing about backsliding January 6th. Does heightened outgroup animus mean that the United States is about to sort of be part of this global trend? Are the symptoms that I've just described to you, outgroup animus, widespread misinformation, unwillingness to adopt sound public health practices, are these precursors of support for anti-democratic practices and candidates? To date, I would submit there is no evidence that partisan animus increases support for anything along these lines. The only evidence we have is that this is another extremely powerful study by the same law firm, except that it was designed and carried out by Sean Westwood. They experimentally manipulated feeling thermometer animosity. They had people play a trust game. They told them that the player 2 was a Republican, and if you're a Democrat, the Republican in the dictator game gave you 10 cents, something along those, where you really got screwed by an opposing partisan. So not surprisingly, the manipulation produced huge increases in outgroup animus. So then what the trick is, then they immediately had people do a bunch of other things. Now they're in a heightened state of outgroup animosity. Are people now more willing to support, anti-democratic norms? And they found out of the 62 t-tests they ran, only 3 were large. Basically, it's a bunch of null results. The only spillover effects they found were in the domain of social distancing. Very strong effects. People were less interested in interacting with an opposing, but that was it. Anything beyond that, there was no evidence of downstream spillover. And I can't help, I was asked to review the Calmo and Mason book. It's a very interesting book showing that Americans are now increasingly willing to support violent political ends, violent actions to achieve political ends. Problem, however, is that the survey measures of support for violence are pretty generic and non-specific. And since they've got 3-wave panel data, it turns out you can do some pretty rigorous tests along the lines. I took Phil Converse's course on panel analysis way back, as Michael Schroeder reminded me. I think it was 1971. And the first thing you learn from Phil Converse's panel analysis class is you learn about the black and white model, which is essentially that when you've got 3 waves of panel data, you can key diagnostic indicator of whether or not it's genuine change is the magnitude of the interwave correlations. And if they're identical, if T1, T2, T2, T3, and T1, T3, if those retest correlations are all the same, that's pretty compelling evidence that it's randomness, random change. And indeed, I did that exact same analysis with the 3-wave data from the Calmo, not from their study, but a different study that used exactly the same question wording and 3 waves of data, and it turned out to fit the black and white model pretty damn well. So I think even that, the argument that we ought to be concerned about rising levels of support for political violence, I think we need to take that with a grain of salt. Okay, I'm happy to. I'm sorry that I went over time, but
Perfect.
Okay.
Going up to your question.
Yeah.
Thank you for this. A question about causes for affective polarization. The first you identified was sorting, which seems sort of endogenous to affective polarization almost, given that social distance is an important component of it. And I'm curious about, I guess, the opposite direction of causality, where affective polarization causes sorting. And if you're, what your sense is of the state of the literature on which way causality flows in that way.
Well, now again, it depends on your definition of sorting. If you take the demographic, the cleavage definition, and not the ideological, the confluence of party idea and ideology, I don't think it's not endogenous in terms of these broad historical forces concerning the composition of the two-party coalitions and socio. That's just the way history has evolved. There is an ongoing debate. If you take the ideological, so Greg Huber and now increasingly Anthony Fowler is also part of this group. There's a group of people who are beginning to argue that affective polarization is simply an outgrowth of ideological polarization. And so Greg and his collaborators are arguing that it's the fact that people perceive that they are on opposite sides of an issue that's causing them to give these thermometer and so on. And then there's a bunch of people writing on the other side. I'm kind of like I'm pretty agnostic about that debate. So my sense of the literature, however, I think Greg has his work cut out for him to persuade. I think there's pretty strong evidence to suggest that partisanship is prior to issue preferences. The socialization literature for one. Okay. Don, you were going to say something?
I had two quick questions. One is, given the rise of right-wing authoritarianism in Europe and other places, whether there's a respectable literature developing in comparative studies of affective polarization, where similar things are happening elsewhere.
Yeah.
And the other is, you started out by making a distinction, and just returned to it, given this very interesting question, between ideological polarization on the one side and affective polarization on the other. Roughly speaking, one is more cognitive, the other is more emotional or affective.
Right.
The evidence of regularity is very impressive on the affective polarization side. These are very dramatic differences. They move together over time. And as you said, you left the topic, but you said the ideological literature is much more confused and unclear. And I wonder what you made of that theoretically, the distinction, and whether it resides in some kind of distinction between affective systems and cognitive ones.
Well, I'm still, sufficiently old-fashioned to take your second question first. I don't think that the average citizen is that attentive to the details of public policy. So I still believe the old literature about, the open-ended nature of the times, so on and so forth. I don't think people are that adept with positioning themselves on policy questions. And I think a lot of people are just opting out of those questions by taking the middle ground, opting to be, I'm right in the middle. So I guess in that sense, I'm just not that. I don't think that we have reached the point where the American electorate has become sufficiently familiar with the policy narrative at any point in time. So I'm dubious about this argument that ideological polarization is underlying affective polarization.
What about comparatively?
And that's the more interesting question as far as I'm concerned, because the distinctive aspect of the American case is that it's black and white, because you've only got two parties, so it's in or out. Whereas in the European multi-party context, you've got coalition politics, and so who is in and who is out at any given moment is pretty mixed up. That there may be parties that are part of the governing coalition that may be ideologically speaking, may be far apart. So it's much more confusing. I've only begun to look at the cross-national work. It seems to certainly suggest that the US is significantly higher in terms of the outcome. So maybe there is something about two-party versus multi-party systems, and coalitions versus zero-sum politics, as in the case of the United States. That would be my a priori guess. But I think in the next couple of years, we'll know much more about it, because I do know there's a huge outpouring of European and non-US research on this phenomenon of affective polarization. Yeah.
And so you make comments on the short-term treatments, the fixes. In your view, what are long-term fixes to the affective polarization?
So thank you.
Given that we can't really change the frequent campaigns.
Well, I think that's where we have to begin to work. I think there's the Polarization Research Lab has initiated a thing called the Civility Pledge, where we're asking politicians all across the country to sign a pledge in which they campaign more on the sense of self-promotion than taking down the opposition. And we've had the governor of Utah, when he was one of the first people to participate, and I've forgotten his name, he's a very nice guy. And when they ran this 2022 contest for the governorship, they broke new ground. History was made. The Democratic candidate and the Republican candidate for the governor of Utah they produced joint political ads in which the ad was paid for half by the Democrat, half by the Republican. And they simply featured side by side the Democrat saying, here's what I stand for, and the Republican saying, here's what I stand for. And that, I think, is what we need to build on. That's the kind of intervention that I think will have an impact. And whether or not we can get sufficient people to sign up on that is an open question. But the fact that we've got the governor of Utah, who, by the way, has now become a big, huge fan of this research on affective polarization, at this conference 2 weeks ago, and he showed up and gave the keynote presentation. So it can be done, and this is not some, he's not running for dog catcher. This guy is the governor of Utah, and he is right now the president of the Governors Association. So he's trying to push the word among his colleagues that this is something worth doing. And I think we should all hope that he is successful and that this kind of intervention can take hold and gradually build up. Yes, sir. Yeah.
I'm thinking about the period between the 50s and 70s. And what I don't know is whether these are the unusual times that need to be explained. Or the 50s or the 70s may be the unusual times.
Possibly.
And I was wondering, are there any data or any attempts to try to figure out what might be the abnormal conditions?
Unfortunately, given the history of survey research, we can only go back to the 1940s. And so we can't answer the question about, what are there these historical cycles that we can identify as being normal politics as opposed to periods of turbulence. So it's possible that the post-World War II generations were preoccupied with just this sort of euphoria of the fact that the war is over, and you've got a victorious commander-in-chief who's in office, and charismatic individuals, so on and so forth. But then you had, the Vietnam War, and you had Watergate. So I think you can make a strong case for the fact that what's happening today is abnormal. That the denigration of the opposition is not what you would typically. It would be nice if we had data going back to the Civil War, obviously.
But there is evidence on Congress that goes back that far, that suggests
that's true. During Reconstruction, there were people
Yeah.
being beaten up in Congress.
that maybe what we're experiencing right now is not so unusual. Rather, I'm sorry.
But the social norms were different back then.
Right. That the level of polarization we see in Congress now is like the level of polarization we saw at one time only, and that was before the Civil War.
Yeah. Okay.
Another possibility is just doing machine learning on what's in the press.
Right.
Parties are the adjoined to negative words or not going back in
Mhm.
time.
Yes.
But I don't know if that would work.
That would be a great database because, we have very good chronological data on newspaper text. Yes.
Yeah, on this point, so the content analysis that you've done on the campaign ads, have you tried? I haven't seen whether you've tried.
That was from the Wesleyan Media Project.
Have you tried to look at the increase in kind of maybe not ad hominem, but plane based or vitriolic? You show that comparative ads are negative, obviously, and attack ads are negative. But it's the nature of the ads should, so that you can support this notion that it's not just policy comparisons or policy text, but actually
Based on character attacks, taking precedence, that's right. We'd have to do that. I don't know of anyone who's done that systematically, but that shouldn't be difficult to do. Because obviously you could argue that an attack based on platform, that's totally substantive, it's totally legitimate. But to say that someone, has been accused of corruption, hush money for porn stars, stuff like that, that's much more attacks on a personal level. My suspicion is it's much more on the latter.
I was wondering if you can help me reconcile the differences that I see, I think, in the spillover effects studies that you have presented. Like early on, it was more like individual level. How are you treating someone, whether or not they get a job callback and so forth? And there we're seeing spillover effects. And now we're sort of going to the sort of anti-democratic behaviors and then saying we're not really seeing it there. So I wonder if it's just maybe because we are not really getting at the ladder in a way that is sort of connected to what you were saying before, which is if you ask someone and say, hey, are you not giving this job to someone because they are a Democrat? They would say, no, but they are doing that regardless. So is that, should we not be worried about anti-democratic behaviors?
No, I think that's a really important point. I think one of the limitations of that study I was selling you a minute ago, the Brockman et al. Experiment site where they manipulate affective polarization. The problem with that study is that the manipulation is you're playing with an individual, and this individual is screwing you. So why would that experience of maybe this is just some random guy, he's not Nancy Pelosi. So I was encouraging them to design a manipulation that would be much more societal in appearance and in sort of the experience. Very difficult to come up with something. But so it's possible that the fact that they're not getting any spillover effects is simply because the treatment itself is highly personalized. It's one-on-one interactions.
And I guess maybe also the outcome as well. Like if you're treating an individual versus making a statement about the group, similarly,
yes,
in one way you're more you can be more hidden.
That's right. It would be cool if they could develop a manipulation in which there was something about the actions of a legislature, something about partisan, where you argue that here's the legislature controlled by Republicans and here's what they did, something like what they're doing in South Carolina, like death penalty, if you prescribe an abortion pill, so on and so forth. That I would guess would produce more spillover than the kind of treatment that they're using. So anyone who wants to replicate that, I suggest that's what you do. Yes, sir.
Yeah, this whole thing is very, very interesting. I try to make sense of this. And one thing you are saying, which is very important, is that American affiliation with political parties is choice-based,
Yes.
right? And because it's choice-based, your identity becomes your social identity. And your social identity is what you feel. And so that's the basis for affective polarization. But the choice must come from somewhere, right? So choice requires some kind of choice space. And typically people take it for granted that those choices are available, except they are not really natural thing. Somebody needs to make it up. So there must be some political elite or something which are creating agenda. That's a kind of cognitive polarization component. And that's not really psychological purely. That is,
of course.
That seems like a collective process. And right.
Party
so now it seems to me that CNN or Fox News or all sorts of mass media, social media, and political elite conspire to take advantage of this choice-based system to create agenda, to manipulate those choices. Is it too cynical? Now, once you conceptualize it in this way, seems like that very manipulation of choice space really points to a crisis of democracy more than anything else.
Well,
But to make it a little bit more complete, I was involved in some society, academic society, and election of say president or election of some executive committee members and so on, right? So election committee pick up a few names, right? And that's a clear something going on to explain why this guy and that guy happen to be the candidate for president. But everybody else believe that there are two choices which are kind of seemingly natural, that they come up from somewhere and they make a choice as if they are selecting somebody, except they are not. Those two had been selected beforehand for some reasons which are completely unknown to everybody else. And that seems like a kind of violation of democratic process. And I wonder if something similar might be going on in the last several decades to create some problems which we witness today in this country.
well, I think you're right when you say that the choice set is not entirely subject to choice in the sense that
No, choice requires choice set.
I understand, but
Right.
in this country, the choice set is limited to D and R in terms of realistic prospects of winning.
On top of this, what issues are associated with those two parties, which are fairly fluid and can vary from time to time, which issues are more salient, considered to be more crucial. Those are
Yeah.
appears to be manipulated.
That's true. The branding, the reputations of the parties on particular issues. John Petrasek at UCLA has written very important papers on that phenomenon. So yes, it is true that the parties can sell themselves as being especially effective on a particular issue. But I want to get back to this notion that somehow the media are conspiring with political elites. I find that hard to take seriously because we're talking just about history. Now and then we have had a third party. Most recently, when what was his name? The chicken executive from Ross Perot. We had Ross Perot in 1992, and we had John Anderson in 1976. So now and then we've had third-party candidates bubble up, and the choice set now is, it's not just D and R. It will be. I'm not sure if the ANES actually asked thermometers of Ross Perot and John, and that would be a really interesting test of this idea that when you've got a three-party competition, it's like the question that Don was asking, that so now you've got like a multi-party contest, and does that, just by nature of the choice set being a bit more complicated, does that make the level of animosity less pronounced? That would be a really cool, I'm not sure, we'll have to check and see if the ANES people, I doubt that they asked thermometers on Perot or Anderson. So, but that's absolutely, that's a very good suggestion, and we could certainly look into that.
All right, it's 5 o'clock. This last comment made me think back, I'll say, to Ken Coleman's talk about dynamic partisanship too, and how the parties are setting the agendas based on the space that they perceive as like sort of available to them to capitalize on. So it's nice to see these all come around together. So thank you so much for coming out and taking the time to talk with us.